Hi, friends. I'm Becca Werwell, author of the Road Trip Rescue series of faith-filled contemporary adventures for kids ages 8 to 12. And today we have a special guest. Minda Gomez is here to talk to us about her books. Minda lives in Minnesota with her husband and her three spunky bilingual kids. Their family has created their own brand of Mexigringo as they blend their Papi's Mexican culture with their Mami's Minnesotan culture. When Minda was a young teacher, she spent several summers in Guatemala, which we're going to talk about, teaching English at a children's home and taking language classes. It was here that her love for Latin America was sparked. She lived in Mexico for a year and has traveled extensively throughout Latin America. Minda teaches English at a local elementary school and is passionate about teaching children to be proud of their bilingual superpowers. She is hopeful that her readers will understand that speaking more than one language is one of the many things that can make a kid special. Minda, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a treat.
So before we talk about your books and what inspired you to write this series and all of that, I want to hear more about your connection to Guatemala because I'm so excited. My book right now, Road Trip Return, book 2 in my series, is launching through Kickstarter. And in that story, Daniel, the main character, and his family go on an adventure to Guatemala. So when I saw that you had also traveled a lot, I wanted to hear more about that. So can you share that with us?
Sure, of course. Guatemala is my first love in Latin America. I went there. I'm a teacher, so I have summer vacations off. And before I was married, I took advantage and I traveled during my summers. So my very first summer, I went to Guatemala and I worked at a children's home. So I was teaching English to a group of girls, and that was absolutely life-changing. It was wonderful. And then I also every day would take the chicken bus, which you mentioned in your book, into Antigua, which is a very well-known part of Guatemala where a lot of tourists are. And they also have a lot of small language schools. So that was really how I grew a lot in my Spanish. And it really helped to kind of launch me into becoming more of a fluent Spanish speaker. So the whole time in Guatemala was just amazing. And since then, I have been back. I went back the next summer, and then I've gone for 3 spring breaks as well.
I love that it keeps drawing you back, the country, the culture, because I feel very similar with my experience. I had lived there for a semester during college in Guatemala City, but we did frequent weekend trips. So we were in Antigua. We visited Panajachel, which is the town that's featured mainly in Road Trip Return. And we visited up in the mountains and the coast and all different places. And after that, I couldn't help but going back several times after because it's just, yeah, it's a beautiful country. It's a beautiful culture. I love being immersed in the language. So all of that is super cool to hear that we share that in common. And you also mentioned to me right before we started this interview that you hiked a volcano while you were there, right?
That is right. Yeah. Now I'm blanking out on the name of the volcano. It
wasn't Pacaya, was it?
It was that one. It was Pacaya.
Yeah.
Yep. So I climbed up the volcano, and I remember being so surprised when I got to the top, because when you see movies, you kind of picture it's all full of molten lava and it's just dark and rocky, but it was green and grassy and there were cows up there. And it was just a really cool experience. And in my most recent book, I actually talk about climbing to the top of a volcano, and that's kind of influenced by my journey up the volcano in Guatemala.
In your book, the volcano, is that in Guatemala or is that somewhere else?
No, it's in the Galapagos Islands.
Okay, cool. But
Yeah.
it's cool that you have that connection. And actually, I also hiked Pacaya. That's how I
Yeah.
recognized the name.
Yeah.
And I'd say that was one of like the coolest experiences I've ever had. Actually, I was reading back through some journal entries from my time in Guatemala as I was researching for Road Trip Return. And I think I wrote specifically that day that it was like the coolest experience of my life, which I was also very enthusiastic about everything we saw and did.
Yeah.
But we got to, did you roast marshmallows up at the top?
I don't think so, but I do remember people's shoes melting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we got to roast marshmallows. I mean, it wasn't over like the fire. It was just over the volcanic rock.
Okay. Okay. Oh,
Um,
that's so cool.
so that said, can you tell us about your books, the Martinez Kids Adventures?
Well, of course, I would love to tell you about my books. So the Martinez Kids Adventures they're middle grade books, like chapter books, really, and they are based on my own family. So as you mentioned in the bio, my husband is from Mexico, and I have 3 kids, and we all speak Spanish at home. It's actually kind of a mix of Spanish and English as the kids get older. And so my characters are based on my own family. And instead of being the Gomez family, it's the Martinez family. So the names are changed. But the kids are very familiar to people who know my family. And a lot of the situations and the stories are very similar too. But the part that is different is in my books, there is a character who lives next door whose name is Don Tonio. And he is an inventor, a very wise elderly man, and he has invented a virtual reality machine. So in the secret door, they step into what looks like a regular garden shed, but it brings them into virtual reality. So they turn into animals and they explore different places. And one, they are squirrels and they're up in the treetops, and another, they are marine animals and they're in a coral reef, and another, they're monkeys and they're swinging through the Mexican rainforest. So it's just a way they learn a lot of life lessons based on things that Don Tonio thinks that they need to learn. And it's a lot of Christian values, really, even though I don't call the books Christian books, but they definitely have a value for each story. So that's been a fun thing to write.
I'll say I haven't had the chance to read these books yet, but just hearing you talk about these fun adventures and how different all of them are and the lessons that are in there, I'm really excited to read them. And you talked a little bit about this. I mean, the series is inspired by your family. Is there anything else that inspired you to start writing? What was the initial spark where it's like, oh, I'm going to start this series?
Well, it all happened when we were at the beach. My kids were playing at the beach on one summer evening, and I was talking to my husband. And we were talking about how there was really a need for Spanish language podcasts or stories. My family listens to Adventures in Odyssey. I don't know if you're familiar with those.
Oh, yes. Love Adventures in Odyssey.
Yes. So they are English language. Just they're fun stories, but they also teach lessons. And we really hadn't been able to find very much in Spanish. And so I said, I'll sit down and write some stories, and then you can record them, and it will just be something fun for our family. But when I sat down and started writing, it kind of turned into a book. And now we do have, it didn't turn into a podcast, but we do have one audiobook, and the second book is in process right now of being recorded. So
that's so I was going to ask if they were in audio. So are they in audio in English and in Spanish?
Not yet. My husband someday will maybe do that. But right now I have a wonderful narrator named Minda Gomez who does all of the work in English.
That's exciting. I'm sure it's exciting to be able to see them in audio. And I love that maybe your husband one day would consider recording the Spanish too. That would be fun to have both.
Yeah, that's one of the goals, but it's kind of a stretch goal right now. So
yeah. Got to focus on one thing at a time, especially when you have this many stories. And very cool. Do you have a favorite character, or maybe in a specific book, like a favorite scene?
Well, of course I love Don Tonio and his wife, Doña Rosa, because they are just so warm and wise with the children. And they're not even actual grandparents. They are kind of like adoptive grandparents to the kids. And they're inspired by our actual next door neighbors, who are also just wonderful with our own kids. And so it's just kind of fun. Doña Rosa, she loves to make Mexican treats, and she loves to teach the kids. So she teaches them how to make tortillas and different things like that in the stories. So Don Tonio and Doña Rosa are definitely special characters to me.
Do you ever share any of the recipes that are in your books?
Yes. At the end of each book, I have a recipe from the book.
Oh, I love that. How fun. So a family could read the story together and then get to make a recipe that happens in the book. And that leads me into my next question, actually. How do you celebrate language and culture in your stories? So one way would be through these recipes. What other ways do you celebrate those things in your stories?
Well, throughout the book, I do work Spanish words into the story and context, and there is a glossary at the beginning, but you could really read through it without the glossary and understand it for the most part because it's really worked in context. So I have some Spanish worked in, just like a normal bicultural family often kind of flows between one language and another. Um, I have a lot of mentions of food because I love food and I love Mexican food especially. So they have a lot of mentions of food. In The Arctic Quest, my second book, they actually are taking a road trip down to Mexico to visit their grandparents for Christmas. And so we have a description of a Mexican Christmas celebration in the book that lasts a couple chapters. And that is based very directly on our family Christmas that we celebrated down there a couple years ago.
Oh, fun. So this all brings, I have two questions after you say all this.
Okay.
Do you have a favorite Mexican dish?
I love enchiladas verdes.
Okay.
So like
I've never had them.
enchiladas with green salsa. They're
Okay.
delicious. So that's probably my favorite. But I like so many Mexican foods, it's almost hard to choose.
I know it's hard to pick favorites. I'm asking you all these favorite questions. Favorite character, favorite food.
Do you have a favorite Mexican food?
Oh, well, I loved in Guatemala. So this isn't Mexican food, but in Guatemala they had these huge flour tortillas. It was in Puerto Barrios, which is like on the I'm gonna forget directions. East Coast. Yeah.
Okay.
It's on the east coast of Guatemala. And it was like these huge, thick flour tortillas, and it was served on a plate. And then on top of the tortilla, there were like beans and other things on top. And those were just delicious. I don't even know what it's actually
called. Like a baleada
called.
from Honduras.
Maybe. But those were delicious. And then I also loved in El Salvador, we had a lot of, is it pupusas?
Pupusas, yes,
those were so good. It's like a tortilla stuffed with beans and usually cheese. I would not have cheese on mine because I don't like cheese. I know I'm an outlier in that area, but yeah. And in Road Trip Return, I do have recipes included in the back of that as well. That was a stretch goal on our Kickstarter campaign, and we reached that. And one of the recipes I put in the back of the book, which I didn't even put in the actual book, it had been originally in the book, and then that scene was cut. But I still wanted to include it as a recipe. It was rellenitos de plátano. Have you had those?
I don't think so. What are they?
It's a dessert. It's made of plantains, and they are like, it's cooked, and they're sweet plantains, and it's filled with beans and sometimes like chocolate. And then they're like rolled in sugar and they're fried. They're delicious. So it's such an interesting dessert because you're like, well, what, like made of bananas and beans and but those I really love. So I have a recipe for that in the back of Road Trip Return.
I'm going to have to try that.
Yeah, they're delicious. So my other question, and this is like taking it in a different direction than the food talk, but so you have your books in English and in Spanish, correct?
Correct.
So then in your English books, you have some Spanish words sprinkled throughout. When you translate it into Spanish, do you do the opposite with the English?
I do have English words worked in, but that was a challenge because it wouldn't make sense for Don Tonio and Doña Rosa to be working in English words randomly. So I really had to think about where would be the places that English would fit naturally. Where would people naturally throw in English? So for example, Araceli, who's the littlest one, because she's the youngest sibling, she ends up speaking a lot more English just because she's around her brothers that already speak English. And this is based on real life. But she has a lot of the English words. And then the kids, obviously, since they're second generation, they speak a lot of English in the book too. So I kind of tried to sprinkle it in thoughtfully in places where it would make sense rather than just flipping everything because that didn't really work.
That's so interesting. I think, so you do all the translation yourself for the books?
No, my husband and I work on them together.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And then I had a team of beta readers who helped me with the most recent one for the Island Rescue. That one, it was amazing because I had a team of people from different parts of Latin America and from Spain, different Spanish speakers representing different dialects. And I really asked them, tell me, are there things that you wouldn't understand? And So I was trying to keep that Mexican flair, but also make it
Uh-huh.
accessible to people from all over the
That's
Latin
amazing.
America. So, yeah.
That's amazing. It's like a team effort, a family effort, but then also drawing in people from lots of different countries to account for the different dialects. I think that's something that like we don't always think of when we think of a book being translated. We're like, oh, that's a pretty simple process, but it's not because it's often not word to word, like you're talking about the language and the different
Mhm.
meanings of words. We might have sayings in English that don't translate to Spanish and
Mhm.
the other way around. And then you're trying to account for different dialects and different people from different cultures have different words with different meanings. There's a lot to keep in mind as you're translating.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it just keeps getting more challenging every time I do it because I keep thinking about more things I want to do. But I feel like it really makes the final product that much stronger too.
Yeah, that's cool as you continue with the books in the series to think of more ways to build on that and to incorporate more people into your process.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a great question.
Minda, I have so enjoyed hearing about your books, about the inspiration behind them, and I know readers are going to want to learn more. So, for those readers, where can they go to learn more about you and your books?
The best place would probably be on my website, mindagomez.com. And that will have links to information about the books, different places where you can buy it. For example, links to Amazon or other online places. But it also has a lot of extra goodies on there. So it has biographies, it has games, it has Spanish pronunciation, book reviews, including a book review for Road Trip Return. So there's a lot of good things that can be found on the website.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for reviewing Road Trip Return, and thank you for
Yeah.
joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Becca. It was wonderful.